My name is Walter Green. I am 76 years old, and though I have lived all my life in Missouri, the last 4 years have felt like another country, one where time moves slowly, where silence fills the rooms more heavily than air, and where the person who once shared every morning and every evening with me is no longer here. My wife Joan passed away in late autumn on a gray Sunday when the maple leaves had already fallen and the sky itself seemed to be mourning. She was taken by a sudden heart attack at the age of 72, and I was left standing in the kitchen, staring at a pot of soup she had been preparing only minutes earlier, realizing that everything I had taken for granted, the quiet conversations over dinner, the laughter when she teased me about misplacing my glasses, the warm presence in the next room, had vanished in a breath. Since that day, my life has become an exercise in rituals that try, however inadequately, to preserve her presence in the corners of this house and in the chambers of my mind. And among these rituals, the most important has been my weekly visit to her grave. The cemetery is not far, just outside the edges of St. Louis, a modest place with rows of stones that catch the morning light, and I walk there whenever I am able, sometimes with my cane if the stiffness in my hip acts up, sometimes slowly, but determinedly on my own. Each week I bring white lilies because Joan loved them, their scent sharp but clean, and because she once told me, half-jokingly, that if anyone ever tried to decorate her resting place with carnations, she would haunt them forever. I talked to her as if she were sitting across the table, telling her about the small things, what I ate for dinner, how the weather has been, whether the Cardinals won or lost. And though I know it may sound foolish to anyone else, it is the only way I have found to keep the connection alive, the only thread that makes the empty house less unbearable. I polish the stone with my handkerchief, straighten the little flag that sometimes tips in the wind, and always pause before leaving, whispering her name, with the same tenderness as when she was alive. My house is small, a single-story brick home that we bought nearly 40 years ago when our son Ronald was still in grade school. And while many of the neighbors have changed over the years, the house itself has remained stubbornly the same, filled with photographs on the walls and furniture that might be out of fashion, but carries the marks of our shared life. The living room still holds the rocking chair where Joan would sit with her knitting. The kitchen bears the faint smell of cinnamon from her endless pies, and the bedroom is as she left it, her side of the dresser untouched because I cannot bring myself to disturb the arrangement of scarves and jewelry boxes. Yet as much as the house is filled with memory, it is equally filled with absence, for the laughter and warmth are gone, and the only sound now is the ticking of the old mantel clock and the shuffle of my own steps echoing in empty rooms. My relationship with my son has become strained over the years, and though I once imagined that Joan's death might bring us closer together, the opposite has proved true. Ronald has built his life around his career in finance and around his wife Melissa, who has never concealed her impatience with my old-fashioned ways, and though I tried to be generous, offering them help whenever they needed it, the gratitude was thin and the affection thinner. They rarely visit unless there is a holiday obligation, and when they do, the conversations are short, filled with glances at their phones, as if my words were burdens they could not wait to put down. My 2 grandchildren, Jacob and Emma, are now in their late teens, and while I once dreamed of teaching Jacob how to fix the engine of an old car, or showing Emma how Joan used to make quilts, those days never came, and the distance has grown so wide that on birthdays they send nothing more than a hurried text message. Still, I have held to the hope, fragile as it may be, that in time they might soften, that blood might prove stronger than indifference, and that my memories of family dinners filled with laughter could return in some form. It is this hope that keeps me from cutting ties completely, though I confess that more often than not, I feel like a forgotten relic they tolerate, rather than a father or grandfather they cherish. Joan, I believe, saw the drift long before I did. She once told me quietly, after a strained visit from Ronald, that our son had grown into a man more practical than kind, and that while she loved him, she did not recognize in him the warmth that once defined our family. I brushed her concerns aside at the time, unwilling to imagine that her intuition could be so accurate. But now, with the benefit of hindsight and loneliness, I know she was right. My days are simple. I wake early, brew coffee as Joan used to, though never as well, eat toast in the kitchen where sunlight filters through lace curtains, and then spend the morning reading the newspaper, doing crossword puzzles, or walking slowly in the park nearby. Sometimes I volunteer at the library, shelving books and exchanging polite words with strangers. But even then I find myself counting the hours until I can return to the cemetery, where silence feels like companionship rather than isolation. The world has become faster, more impersonal, and at my age, I often feel invisible, as though I am already halfway into the ground myself. Yet each time I visit Joan's grave, I feel anchored, reminded that I was once loved, once chosen, once the center of someone's life. And that thought gives me just enough strength to endure another week. I am not a man given to dramatic displays, but I am not immune to hurt. And the truth is that every small slight, every missed phone call, every look of impatience from Ronald and Melissa cuts more deeply than I let on. I pretend not to notice when Melissa complains about the smell of old books in my house. I smile faintly when Jacob mocks my outdated cell phone. I nod when Ronald insists that I should consider selling the house and moving into an assisted living facility. But behind these restrained responses lies a heart that aches for respect, for simple kindness, for acknowledgement that I am still here, still human, still deserving of dignity. Joan would never have allowed such disregard. She was fierce in her loyalty, and though she often scolded me for being too mild, too forgiving, she balanced my quietness with her fire. Without her, I sometimes feel like a house with one wall missing, exposed to the cold winds of neglect. It is from this place of quiet routine, of lingering grief, of fragile hope and deepening disillusionment that my story begins. I had no intention of stirring conflict with my family, no desire for revenge, no thought beyond tending to Joan's memory and living out my remaining years in peace. But life does not consult our intentions. What I will recount began as an ordinary visit to the cemetery. Another morning when I carried lilies and whispered to my wife. And yet it became the moment when the past and the present collided violently, when grief turned to outrage, and when the line between remembering the dead and protecting their honor was crossed in a way I could never have imagined. Until that day, I thought loneliness was the worst burden I could bear. But I was wrong. Far heavier is the burden of betrayal, especially when it comes from those you once believed were your own flesh and blood. The day that altered the fragile rhythm of my quiet existence began like any other Sunday, marked by the same careful sequence of small rituals that I had repeated for years as though keeping them alive might somehow hold back the tide of grief. I rose at dawn, my bones aching in that familiar way that reminds a man his youth is long behind him, brewed coffee that never tasted as rich as Joan's, and prepared a modest breakfast that I ate more out of habit than hunger. Then I dressed slowly, choosing the jacket Joan always said made me look dignified, brushed the sleeves with the care of a man who knows appearances matter less for vanity than for respect, and gathered the bouquet of lilies I had purchased the previous afternoon. The morning air was brisk, tinged with the sweetness of early spring, and though the walk to the cemetery required the support of my cane, I welcomed the ache in my leg as proof that I was still moving forward, still capable of keeping my promise to her. When I reached the cemetery, the sun was just climbing above the trees, spilling long rays of light across the headstones. And for a moment, I felt the same quiet peace that always accompanied my visits. I walked the narrow gravel path, greeted the familiar names carved into stone, and finally reached Joan's resting place, where the grass was still damp with dew and the marble gleamed pale and solemn. I set down the lilies, whispered her name, and was about to begin my usual quiet conversation when I noticed from the corner of my eye movement and noise a few rows away. At first, I thought it might be another visitor, someone tending to a grave, with the reverence I understood so well. But the sound was too loud, too careless, more like the laughter spilling from a bar than the hushed voices one expects among the dead. As I turned, my heart jolted with disbelief, for standing only a short distance away, at Joan's own grave, were Ronald, his wife Melissa, and several of their friends, dressed casually as if they had come not for mourning, but for some impromptu picnic. They had a blanket spread across the grass, bottles of wine open, glasses in hand, and they were laughing loudly, clinking their glasses in toasts that rang out obscenely against the stillness of the cemetery. My first thought was that perhaps they had come to honor Joan in their own way, though the sight of their careless celebration immediately soured that hope, and as I stepped closer, I realized with horror that they were leaning against Joan's headstone itself, using it as though it were nothing more than a convenient table for their bottles. I froze, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. My breath caught somewhere between outrage and heartbreak. Melissa, wearing sunglasses and a bright dress, poured wine into a glass while chatting with one of her friends, and in the process the bottle slipped, tilting too far, and a stream of red liquid splashed across the stone, staining the carved letters of Joan's name with the dark smear of spilled Merlot. The group erupted in laughter. Someone joked about Joan finally having a drink, and Ronald himself chuckled, making no effort to correct them, no effort to apologize, no recognition at all that what they had done was not merely careless, but sacrilegious. For a long moment I could not move, my cane trembling in my hand, my eyes fixed on the sight of that stain spreading across the stone, like an insult etched into the very memory of the woman I had loved for 50 years. My mouth opened, but words failed me. For how could I, in the face of such casual cruelty, express the depth of my anguish? Finally, my voice emerged, cracked but firm, demanding to know what they thought they were doing, how they could desecrate her grave with their laughter and their wine. The group quieted, only slightly, more surprised at my tone than ashamed of their actions. And Ronald turned toward me with that familiar smirk that I had come to know too well, the one that carried not only indifference, but superiority. "Dad," he said, as if addressing a child rather than his father, "it's just a bit of fun. Mom wouldn't want us standing around weeping forever. She'd want us to celebrate life, not mope like you do every week." His words struck me harder than a blow, not because of their content, which was hollow, but because of the ease with which he dismissed the sanctity of his mother's memory. Melissa added with a laugh, "Besides, it's only stone, Walter. Don't be so dramatic. Joan wouldn't care about a little wine." Her friends nodded, sipping from their glasses, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to contradict her. I felt the heat rise in my chest, my voice trembling as I told them to leave, to show some respect, to understand that this was not a place for laughter and spilled drinks, but a place for reverence. Ronald rolled his eyes, muttered something about me being stuck in the past, and turned his back, raising his glass once more in a mock toast. That gesture, more than the words, broke something inside me, for it revealed not just carelessness, but contempt, a deliberate refusal to acknowledge my grief, a mocking of the love that still bound me to Joan, even in her absence. I stepped forward, my cane sinking into the soft earth, and with all the strength I had left in me, I told him that his mother deserved better, that I would not stand by while he turned her resting place into a tavern. He laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Come on, Dad, she's gone. It's just a grave. You need to let go." At that moment, I understood with crushing clarity that the distance between us was not just a matter of years or differing views, but a canyon of values, a void where respect should have been, and that no bridge could span it. Melissa gathered the bottle again, wiping the stone half-heartedly with a tissue that smeared the stain more than it removed, and with a mocking smile, she told me to calm down. The people were staring. Indeed, a few distant visitors had turned their heads, curious about the raised voices, but they quickly looked away, unwilling to intervene in what must have appeared a private family quarrel. For me, however, it was no mere quarrel. It was the moment when the ground beneath my life shifted, when grief turned into outrage, and when the fragile hope I had carried for reconciliation with my son shattered irreparably. I stood there, trembling with the effort of holding myself upright, my hands gripping the cane until my knuckles whitened, and I realized with a painful finality that the son I had raised, the boy Joan and I had cherished, was gone, replaced by a man who could desecrate his own mother's grave without remorse. The wine on the stone glistened darkly in the morning light, and I knew that the stain was not merely liquid, but a symbol of something deeper, the stain of betrayal that no amount of scrubbing could erase. I turned away at last, unable to bear their laughter any longer, and walked slowly back down the gravel path, each step heavier than the last, carrying with me the knowledge that something irrevocable had begun, though I could not yet see where it would lead. When I left the cemetery that day, I thought I had already endured the worst of it, for surely nothing could wound me more deeply than watching my own son and his wife laugh while wine dripped down the stone that bore Joan's name. But as the hours and then the days unfolded, I realized that what I had witnessed was not an isolated insult or a careless lapse in judgment. It was the surface of something darker that had been building quietly behind my back, something that revealed itself piece by piece until the pattern was too plain to deny. I returned home that Sunday, shaken but determined not to let anger dictate my actions, telling myself that perhaps Ronald would feel shame later, that perhaps Melissa would realize her callousness, that perhaps even their friends would whisper about the indecency of it all, and the embarrassment would reach them in the silence that follows drunken laughter. But the phone never rang. No apology came, no message, not even the smallest acknowledgement that anything inappropriate had occurred. Instead, on Tuesday afternoon, when I checked the mailbox, as I always did, I found an envelope from a financial institution I did not recognize, addressed not only to Ronald, but with my name as well. And when I opened it with trembling hands, I discovered documents referring to a loan application in which my house had been listed as collateral. At first I thought it had to be some mistake, perhaps a mailing error, but the more I read, the clearer it became. Ronald had attempted to use a power of attorney that I vaguely remembered signing years ago during a hospital stay when I was recovering from hip surgery, a document I had been told was temporary and narrow in scope, meant only to allow him to handle small bills in case of emergency. Now it seemed he had tried to present that paper as broad authorization, as if I had granted him the right to bind my property for his debts. The application had been flagged for verification, hence the letter reaching me, but the implication was undeniable. While I had been spending my Sundays polishing Joan's stone and whispering my loneliness into the wind, my own son had been scheming. to pull the ground out from beneath me. I carried the papers inside, sat heavily at the kitchen table, and spread them before me like evidence of a crime. The loan amount was large, far larger than any reasonable family expense, and though I could not decipher every technical clause, I knew enough to understand that Ronald was in financial trouble, deeper trouble than he had ever admitted, and that, rather than seek help honestly or face his own mistakes, he had chosen to endanger the last piece of stability I possessed. As I stared at his signature scrawled across the bottom, I felt a wave of humiliation wash over me, not simply because he had tried to cheat me, but because of how thoroughly he must have come to regard me as irrelevant, as an obstacle to be maneuvered around rather than a father to be consulted. The humiliation deepened when I confronted him later that week. I had rehearsed my words carefully, determined to remain calm, to give him the chance to explain. But the moment I stepped into his house, large, immaculate, decorated in Melissa's sterile style of whites and grays that seemed designed to display, rather than to welcome, I knew that the conversation would not go as I hoped. Ronald greeted me with a thin smile, Melissa with none at all, and the grandchildren barely looked up from their glowing phones. I laid the letter on the table, asked him directly to tell me what it meant, and watched as he shrugged with the casual arrogance of a man who believes he has nothing to fear. He claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that the bank had exaggerated, that I was imagining problems, and when I pressed further, his tone shifted to irritation. "Dad," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you never understood how the world works. Property is just an asset, something to leverage when you need liquidity. You sit in that little house as if it's sacred, but it's just wood and brick, nothing more. You can't cling to it forever." Melissa chimed in, her voice sharp, saying that I should be grateful Ronald was taking initiative, that people my age were prone to confusion, and that perhaps it was time to let younger hands manage what remained of my affairs. I stared at her, at the way her lips curled into a smile that did not reach her eyes, and I realized she had been whispering this poison into Ronald's ear for years, shaping his view of me as a relic, a burden, a man to be shuffled aside so their ambitions could breathe freely. The grandchildren, Jacob and Emma, who might once have served as my last hope for warmth, only reinforced the sting. When I tried to appeal to them, reminding them how their grandmother had cherished family, how she had always said respect for one's elders was the root of character, Jacob snorted and muttered something about boomer drama, while Emma, though softer in her expression, avoided my eyes, fiddling nervously with her phone, as if she were ashamed to be seen siding with me. The gap between us felt unbridgeable, not just in age, but in moral gravity, as if we inhabited separate planets where love and loyalty had different meanings. I left their house that evening with my heart heavier than it had ever been, the papers stuffed back into my coat pocket, the echo of Ronald's dismissive words following me into the dark street. The humiliation of the cemetery had been public, a visible stain on Joan's grave. But this was more intimate, a violation of the bond between father and son, and it carried with it the dread knowledge that the sanctuary of my home, the one place where Joan's presence still lingered, was no longer secure. I walked slowly, each step a mixture of sorrow and rage, and by the time I reached my front door, I realized that the conflict I had tried for years to avoid, the confrontation I had tiptoed around out of fear of losing what little family connection remained, was now unavoidable. That night I sat in the living room surrounded by photographs of Joan, of Ronald as a boy, of birthdays and Christmas mornings long past, and I spoke aloud as if Joan could hear me, telling her what had happened, confessing my shame, that our child had grown into a man capable of such betrayal. I remembered her warnings, the moments when she had looked at me with sadness in her eyes and said that Ronald had become too much like the people he worked with, that he measured life in transactions rather than in love, and I admitted to her that She had been right, that I had been too blinded by hope to see it clearly. As I sat there, I felt the fragile fabric of my world begin to tear. For it was no longer a matter of whether I was loved or respected. It was now a matter of survival, of whether I would be allowed to keep the last fragments of dignity that life had, not yet stripped from me. It was in that moment, staring at Joan's picture framed in the dim lamplight, that the first spark of resolve began to kindle, faint and unsteady but undeniable. I had spent years bending, forgiving, excusing, hoping. But there are moments when even the gentlest man must recognize that patience is no longer virtue, but surrender. I did not yet know how I would resist, nor what price it would demand. But I knew I could not allow them to stain Joan's grave with laughter and then stain her memory further by stripping away the home we had built together. Something inside me shifted from grief to defiance, and though my hands trembled, my heart beat with a steadier rhythm than it had in years. The first escalation had come, and with it, the certainty that the quiet life I had imagined for my remaining years was gone, replaced by a struggle I had not sought, but could no longer avoid. The weeks that followed my confrontation with Ronald passed in a haze of restless nights and uneasy days, as though time itself had become uncertain, refusing to move forward in the familiar rhythm of habit, and instead circling back upon itself, each sunrise reminding me of the precariousness of my position. I tried to live as I always had, rising early, brewing coffee, walking to the park. But beneath the surface of these routines lay a constant awareness that something had shifted permanently, that I was no longer simply enduring the loneliness of widowhood, but standing on the edge of a battle I had never imagined would come from within my own blood. For a time, I still clung to the desperate hope that Ronald might realize the seriousness of what he had attempted, that he might call me with a word of apology, that Melissa might soften, or that the grandchildren, in a rare moment of reflection, might feel shame for their coldness. Yet no such call came, no gesture, no attempt at reconciliation. Instead, what arrived one damp morning was another envelope, this one official, stamped with the name of a law office, and inside was a notice stating that Ronald and Melissa were petitioning for joint control of my financial affairs, citing what they described as declining mental capacity. I sat at the table reading the letter again and again, hardly able to believe the words. For here, laid out in the clinical language of legal petition, was the proof that their intentions had moved beyond careless disrespect or even financial opportunism into the realm of deliberate erasure. They were not content to mock me at Joan's grave, not satisfied with trying to slip my house into the balance of their debts. They now sought to strip me of my agency entirely, to declare me incapable of managing my own life, to reduce me to a dependent whose choices they could override with the stroke of a pen. The humiliation of that thought burned deeper than any wound I had ever known, for I had worked diligently all my life, paid every bill, kept careful records, never once defaulted or failed in responsibility, and yet my own son now dared to claim I was no longer competent, all so that he might seize what I had left. At first I was overcome not with rage, but with despair, a heavy, suffocating sense that perhaps resistance was futile, that perhaps this was simply the way of aging, to be slowly robbed not only of strength but of dignity, and that fighting it would only accelerate the inevitable. I sat in the quiet house, staring at the photographs on the walls, and I thought of Joan, of the way she had always known how to ignite my will when I faltered, and I asked aloud what she would want me to do. The answer came not in words, but in memory. Joan at the hospital years ago, standing firm when doctors underestimated her, Joan insisting that we fight through Ronald's teenage rebellion rather than surrender to it. Joan's voice sharp when anyone tried to belittle her family. She would never have accepted such indignity, not for herself and not for me. That recollection stirred something in me, a realization that grief had made me too passive, that I had confused love with silence, and that if I did not act now, the last pieces of my life would be decided not by me, but by those who had already proven they valued me only as a means to their ends. It was in that moment that the crisis became clear. Either I would submit to the petition, let them dictate the terms of my final years, or I would resist, no matter how exhausting, no matter how painful, because surrendering would mean not only losing my home, but betraying the memory of the woman who trusted me to protect what we had built. I knew then that the days of quiet tolerance were over. I gathered the papers, put them in a folder, and the very next morning I walked, slowly and with difficulty, to the office of an old lawyer I had consulted once after Joan's death about the probate of her estate. He greeted me with polite surprise, asked after my health, and listened without interruption as I explained what Ronald and Melissa were attempting. When I handed him the petition, I saw the flicker of disbelief in his eyes turn quickly to indignation, and for the first time in months I felt the faint relief of not being entirely alone, of having at least one voice that recognized the cruelty of what was being done to me. The lawyer explained that such petitions were not uncommon, that adult children sometimes sought control of their parents' assets under the guise of protection, but that in my case, given the lack of medical evidence and my clear articulation of events, their chances would be slim if I fought it. Still, the process would be unpleasant, invasive even, requiring evaluations, court appearances, and above all, stamina. I left his office with a stack of papers and instructions, and though my legs ached and my breath came heavy by the time I reached the street, there was also a steadiness in my chest I had not felt in years. The steadiness that comes when a man knows he has crossed a threshold and can no longer look back. That evening, as the sky darkened and I sat again before Joan's photograph, I whispered to her that I had made my decision, that I would fight not only for myself, but for the sanctity of the life we had built, for the honor of her memory. I understood now that the spilled wine on her grave had been more than an accident, more than a cruel gesture. It had been a sign of what they were willing to do, a foreshadowing of the contempt they held for the things I cherished. If I did nothing, if I allowed them to succeed, then the laughter that stained her stone would become the laughter that carried them into the home she and I had built, a house stripped of photographs, stripped of history, sold for their gain, while I was confined to some sterile room in a facility I did not choose. That was the future they imagined, but it would not be the future I allowed. It was here, at this midpoint, that the story of my grief ceased to be a tale of mourning and became one of defiance. The moment when the quiet widower who once believed patience was enough finally understood that silence in the face of betrayal is complicity. I knew the road ahead would be harsh, that Ronald and Melissa would not retreat easily, that their cruelty would sharpen as their desperation grew. But I also knew with absolute clarity that if I did not stand firm now, I would vanish, not only from the world, but from my own sense of self. And so, with trembling hands, but a steady heart, I began to prepare, for the battle for my dignity had begun in earnest, and there could be no turning back. The weeks after I made my decision to resist were marked by a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity, as though I were a man simultaneously carrying a great weight and yet walking with a new sense of purpose, for each day brought with it both the fatigue of age and the fire of determination. I had expected Ronald and Melissa to retreat once they realized their petition would be challenged, but instead they redoubled their efforts, and it was in the relentless escalation of their campaign against me that I saw clearly, perhaps for the first time, the full depth of their ambition and their contempt. The documents they had filed were not withdrawn. In fact, they supplemented them with letters from acquaintances of theirs, neighbors, co-workers, even a family friend, who were persuaded to write statements claiming that I had become forgetful, confused, prone to mistakes. Reading those words was like encountering a distorted reflection of myself. For though I am slower now, though I misplace my glasses or struggle with a stiff hip, I have never lost the sharpness of my memory, never once forgotten to pay a bill, never once put myself or anyone else in danger. Yet here, on legal paper, were the false testimonies of strangers painting me as a man already slipping into senility. And behind every line of those lies I could hear the voice of Melissa, orchestrating, persuading, perhaps even bribing them to shape the image she needed the court to see. The betrayal did not stop with paper. Soon I began receiving visits from social workers who said they had been notified of concerns about my well-being. One came in the early afternoon, clipboard in hand, asking questions in a careful but condescending tone. Did I remember what day it was? Did I know the name of the president? Could I identify the medications I took each morning? I answered calmly, suppressing the indignation that threatened to spill from me. But inside I was seething at the thought that Ronald and Melissa had stooped to this, inviting strangers into my home to assess my competence as though I were a child. I passed each evaluation easily, and in their written notes they marked me lucid and independent. But the fact that I had to endure it at all left a mark on me. It was as though they were trying not only to steal my property, but to erase my very identity, to reduce me from a man who had lived and worked and loved into a case file to be judged by others. The grandchildren, too, became instruments of this campaign, though whether by choice or by manipulation I could not tell. Jacob, the older one, began to call occasionally, not out of warmth, but with a rehearsed politeness, asking questions that seemed designed to trip me. What was the name of his college again? What subject was he studying? When was his birthday? When I answered correctly, he would mutter something vague, as though disappointed, and quickly end the call. Emma called once as well, her tone hesitant, and she asked if I ever forgot to turn off the stove, or if I had trouble remembering where I kept things. And though I could hear a trace of reluctance in her voice, I knew she was not calling of her own accord. I imagined Melissa standing nearby, listening, coaching her, perhaps even writing the questions down. That night I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the phone, and I realized that the distance between me and my grandchildren was now more than generational. It was moral, for they were being taught not how to love their grandfather, but how to test him, how to treat him as a liability. The humiliation deepened one evening when I went to the grocery store, as I always did on Thursdays, and found myself face to face with an old acquaintance who asked with a sympathetic smile whether I was feeling better. I asked what she meant, and she replied that she had heard I was having episodes, and that Ronald was doing everything he could to care for me. My face burned with shame, for it was clear that rumors were already circulating, that Melissa's words had leaked into the community, turning me from a respected retiree into an object of pity. I finished my shopping quickly, returned home, and sat for a long time staring at the bags on the counter, feeling as though the walls of my world were closing in. The house, once my refuge, was becoming a cage in which every knock at the door might bring another stranger with questions, every phone call another trap, every glance from a neighbor another reminder that my dignity was being chipped away piece by piece. Yet it was also in this deepening assault that my resolve hardened. I returned to the lawyer, handed him every paper, every note, every memory of these encounters, and he told me calmly that such tactics, though cruel, were common in cases like mine. "They will try to wear you down," he said, "to make you so tired that you surrender. But if you endure, if you remain steady, the truth will hold." His words steadied me, but more than that, they ignited something stubborn in me, for I realized that the years I had spent as an accountant, carefully balancing ledgers, meticulously preserving order, had prepared me for this. They thought they could rewrite my life with lies. But I had records, I had clarity, I had memory, and I would use them. The second escalation came to its sharpest point one Sunday, exactly a month after the wine had been spilled on Joan's grave, when I returned to the cemetery to place fresh lilies and found, to my shock, that the stone itself had been defaced. The red stain had long since faded, washed away by rain. But now there were scratches along the marble, deliberate gouges, as though someone had dragged a sharp object across her name. My knees nearly gave way as I lowered myself to the ground, tracing the damage with trembling fingers. And though I could not prove who had done it, I knew with the certainty of instinct that it was connected, that it was meant to unsettle me, to break my spirit. Whether it was Ronald himself, emboldened by his contempt, or some cruel friend urged on by Melissa, I did not know, but the message was clear. They would not hesitate to desecrate even her memory to get what they wanted. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table with Joan's picture before me, I made a vow. I would not let them succeed. If they wanted to see me as weak, I would show them strength. If they wanted to brand me as incompetent, I would demonstrate competence. And if they dared to insult her resting place again, I would answer in a way they could never anticipate. It was no longer just about protecting my home or my finances. It was about defending the dignity of the woman who had shared my life, the sanctity of the love that had defined me. Their campaign had escalated beyond greed into desecration. And in that escalation, they had awakened something in me that grief had long suppressed. The fire of a man who has nothing left to lose but his honor. From that point forward, every humiliation they tried to inflict only strengthened my determination. When another social worker arrived unannounced, I greeted him with my medical records neatly arranged, my bills all paid to the day, my prescriptions organized in labeled bottles, and I watched the surprise flicker in his eyes as he realized he had walked into the home not of a senile old man, but of someone more orderly than half his caseload. When Ronald called to berate me, his voice rising with frustration, I remained calm, recording the call with the small device my lawyer had suggested I use, capturing every slip of arrogance, every admission of his debts, every word that revealed his motives. When Melissa tried to confront me in person, arriving at my door with her saccharine smile and her claims that she was only trying to help, I did not invite her in, but stood firmly on the porch, telling her in a voice that surprised even me that her concern was neither wanted nor welcome, and that she should save her false sympathy for those who did not know her as I did. The escalation was painful, humiliating, relentless, but it was also clarifying, for it stripped away the last illusions I had held about reconciliation, about the possibility of warmth. I saw them for what they were, not family in any meaningful sense, but adversaries who had chosen to betray rather than to love, who had decided that greed mattered more than blood. And in that clarity, I found strength I had not known remained in me. The second escalation had been their attempt to break me, but instead it had forged me, like steel tempered in fire. I was no longer simply a grieving widower. I was a man preparing to fight, to strike back not with violence, but with truth, with law, with the unassailable dignity of someone who refuses to be erased. The day of the hearing arrived with a heaviness that seemed to press against my chest from the moment I opened my eyes, as if the air itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. For though I had endured weeks of humiliation, of false reports, of whispered rumors that painted me as a man already lost to confusion, today was the day when those lies would be tested under the cold light of law. And I knew that everything, my home, my independence, the very respect I still carried for myself, balanced on what would be said and shown in that room. I dressed carefully, choosing the same navy jacket I had worn at my wedding anniversary dinner with Joan years earlier, smoothing the lapels with hands that trembled only slightly. And I carried with me not just papers and files, but the quiet resolve that had been growing in me since the first moment wine had spilled across her stone. The courthouse was crowded, its marble floors echoing with the shuffle of strangers, and as I walked through its corridors, leaning on my cane, but moving steadily, I felt the gaze of people who saw only an old man. Yet inside, I knew I carried something greater than age. I carried truth, memory, and the unbroken thread of dignity. When I entered the courtroom, Ronald and Melissa were already seated, their clothes immaculate, their expressions polished into masks of concern, as though they were long-suffering children reluctantly forced to rescue a declining parent. Melissa cast me a smile laced with pity, a performance for the judge, while Ronald nodded curtly, his eyes avoiding mine. And behind them sat Jacob and Emma, their faces pale, uncertain whether they believed in the show their parents had staged. My lawyer guided me to our table, his calm voice a steady anchor, and as I settled into the chair, I looked once more at Joan's photograph, tucked into the inner pocket of my jacket, and whispered silently to her that I would not fail her. The proceedings began with Melissa's voice, smooth and rehearsed, as she spoke of my supposed forgetfulness, of bills she claimed I had misplaced, of conversations she alleged I could not recall. Ronald followed, his words heavy with feigned sorrow, insisting that they sought only to protect me, that they feared I might fall victim to scams, that my health was fragile and my judgment impaired. They painted a portrait of me as a man fading into confusion, a man clinging to memories while incapable of managing the present. And though their performance might have swayed those who did not know the truth, I felt a strange calm as I listened, for I knew what they did not, that every word they spoke was about to be dismantled, not by anger or theatrics, but by the quiet power of preparation. When my lawyer stood, he began not with argument, but with evidence, laying before the court the meticulous records I had kept. Every bill paid on time, every medical appointment attended, every detail noted in my precise handwriting. He presented the testimony of the social workers who had visited my home, all of whom had written that I was lucid, independent, and organized. He played the recording of Ronald's phone call, in which my son's irritation had bled through as he spoke not of concern, but of debts, of liquidity, of seeing my house as nothing more than an asset. And then he invited me, gently but firmly, to speak for myself. I rose slowly, every joint in my body protesting, but when I stood upright, leaning lightly on my cane, I felt taller than I had in years. I looked first at the judge, then at Ronald, and finally at the gallery where strangers sat watching, and I began to speak. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the steadiness of a man who has lived long enough to know that truth requires no embellishment. I told them of my life with Joan, of the house we had built together, of the years of work I had given without complaint, of the routines that anchored my days since her passing. I admitted my grief, my loneliness, the slowness of my steps, but I also declared that grief is not incompetence, that loneliness is not confusion, that the slowing of the body does not mean the fading of the mind. And then, though it cut me to do so, I described what had happened at the cemetery, the spilled wine, the laughter, the words that dismissed Joan's resting place as just a stone. And I felt the weight of silence in the room as those listening realized that the petition before them was not born of love or concern, but of contempt. For a moment, as I spoke, I allowed myself to look directly at Ronald, and in his eyes I saw not shame, but anger, the fury of a man whose scheme was unraveling. And in Melissa's I saw the tightness of control slipping, her practiced smile cracking at the edges. When I finished, my voice low but steady, I sat down again, and the lawyer placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, a small gesture that told me I had done what was needed. The judge spoke at length, her words careful, but the conclusion was clear. The petition was denied, the claims of my incapacity rejected, and in her formal tone there was even a trace of reproach for those who had attempted such a cruel misuse of the law. For a moment I closed my eyes, letting the relief wash over me, not as triumph, but as vindication. For this was not about victory over Ronald and Melissa. It was about proving that I was still myself, that Joan's trust in me had not been misplaced. But the climax did not end there. After the decision, as the courtroom emptied, I remained seated, waiting until Ronald and Melissa gathered their things. And when Ronald finally looked at me, his face red with barely contained fury, I spoke quietly but firmly so that only he and his family could hear. I told him that I had already rewritten my will, that neither he nor Melissa nor their children would inherit a single cent, that the house, the savings, every last asset would go to a scholarship fund in Joan's name to support young nurses who carried the compassion she had lived by. You spilled wine on her grave, I said, my voice steady, but I have poured out your future, and I do it without regret. For the first time, Ronald's composure broke, his mouth opening as if to shout, but no words came, and Melissa gripped his arm with white-knuckled fingers, pulling him away before the eyes of strangers could witness his unraveling. As I left the courthouse, walking slowly, but with a steadiness that surprised even me, I felt no joy, no gloating, only a profound sense of release, as though the weight that had pressed against me for months had finally lifted. The battle was not only about property or papers. It had been about dignity, about refusing to let the memory of my wife be trampled, about proving that even in old age, when the world expects silence, one can still speak with clarity and strength. The climax had come not in shouting or anger, but in the quiet, unshakable assertion of truth. And as I stepped into the sunlight, I whispered Joan's name, knowing she would have smiled, knowing she would have said I had finally found the fire she always knew I carried within me. In the days after the hearing, the house that had so long felt like a tomb of silence seemed to breathe again. Not because Joan had returned to fill its rooms with her voice, but because the constant shadow of fear and humiliation had finally lifted, leaving behind a clarity I had not known in years. The ticking of the mantel clock no longer sounded like the countdown to defeat, but like the rhythm of survival, each chime a reminder that I had endured, that I had been tested and had not been erased. I moved more slowly than I once had, yes, and each step with my cane reminded me of my age. But within me there was a steadiness, a renewed sense of ownership over the life that remained to me. The photographs on the walls no longer seemed to accuse me of weakness, but to honor the fact that I had defended what they represented, that I had refused to allow those memories to be desecrated for the sake of greed. Ronald and Melissa did not call me after the decision, nor did the grandchildren, and though at first there was a pang of emptiness at the finality of that silence, it was quickly replaced by a recognition that I was freer now than I had ever been. Their absence was not a loss, but a cleansing, for they had chosen their path, and I had chosen mine. and I no longer had to bend beneath the false hope that blood would somehow redeem what years of betrayal had already proven false. When I walked again to the cemetery, lilies in hand, I felt lighter, not because grief had vanished, but because it no longer carried the burden of humiliation. I stood before Joan's grave, the scratches on the marble still visible, but the stone polished clean, and I whispered to her what I had done, how I had severed the line of inheritance, how everything we had saved would instead carry her name forward. Through the scholarship fund that would give young people a chance at the compassion she embodied, I imagined her smile, not triumphant but gentle, the kind that always told me I had finally understood what mattered most. Neighbors who had once looked at me with pity now stopped to greet me with respect. For word of the courtroom had spread, and while gossip had once painted me as frail and confused, now the story was one of endurance, of a man who had stood against his own blood and held fast. I did not bask in it, for pride was never my nature, but I accepted it quietly, as one accepts sunlight after a storm, not as glory, but as simple warmth. In the evenings, I began to read again, books that had gathered dust since Joan's passing, and I found in them not escape but companionship. The voices of authors reminding me that even in solitude, one is never fully alone. As weeks turned to months, I adjusted to this new chapter of life. The lawyer finalized the scholarship in Joan's name, and when the first letter of gratitude arrived from a young nursing student who had received support, I sat at the kitchen table with tears on my cheeks, realizing that the love Joan and I had built was not buried with her, but carried forward, rippling outward into lives we would never know. The knowledge filled me with a quiet peace, for it meant that Joan's presence was no longer confined to my memories or to the stone in the cemetery, but alive in the work and compassion of strangers who would never spill wine upon her name. As for Ronald, I have no doubt that bitterness festers in him, perhaps sharpened by Melissa's whispers, and that he curses my decision in the privacy of his home. But I no longer carry the weight of that knowledge. He made his choices, and in doing so, he lost not only inheritance, but the bond of father and son. And though that truth is heavy, it is also just. I will not pursue him with anger, nor waste my remaining days on thoughts of revenge, for the true reversal has already been written. The man who tried to strip me of dignity will live the rest of his life knowing that his schemes not only failed, but cost him the future he thought he was entitled to. In the quiet of my evenings, I sometimes sit with Joan's photograph in my hands and reflect on the strange path grief has taken me, from despair to humiliation, from betrayal to defiance, and finally to this place of resolution. I know that my years are limited, that the world moves on without me, but I also know that I have not allowed myself to be erased, that I have poured out what remained of my strength not into bitterness, but into a legacy that honors love rather than greed. And though the house is still silent, the silence no longer feels empty. It feels earned, like the closing of a chapter written fully to its end.